So I think one of the really fascinating things that I saw for this event was this amazing quote from Abraham Lincoln where he said, the best way to predict the future is to create it. And I thought that applies so much to the work that we've been doing, trying to create an outcome in a complex system where we can't control the different bits. So I thought it'd be interesting to draw the line, because you and I have worked together for such a long time. We worked on the Paris Agreement, where we were like right in the center of the heat there, and how do you pull those pieces together? Now Glasgow, with the role that you've got, and then through to this decade, which, as we know, really couldn't be more important. I mean, if we don't get on top of this issue by 2030, we've basically lost control of the climatic system. Yeah. So let's start with Paris. I mean, I would say that one of the interesting things about Paris was the emergence of togetherness there against the context of really complete division for decades on climate, came not from a sense of perfection around what we were trying to achieve, but that we were able to create this magic missing ingredient of momentum. Like, for a while, there was like decades of arguing about what's fair, how does it work, and then in Paris, there was this moment that came together that everyone said, imperfect, perfect, this is the moment that we're going to dig in, we're going to make progress, we're going to make it happen. And that built into a wave of momentum that kind of crashed over us, which is instructive for me in thinking about how do we change the world. So how do you see it?
That triggers two thoughts. First is that it was a remarkable moment of solidarity, and I remember it in the closing plenary, hardened negotiators, battle, war negotiators, high-fiving, hugging. Yeah. This is pre-COVID, you could do that. And of course, solidarity not just amongst nation states, but amongst faith communities, businesses. This is the beginning of this sort of new multilateralism of others coming into the room. I think also, crucially, it was a sort of embracing of the imperfect. I mean, so often what seems to happen is people would rather be right and fail than be nearly right or messily wrong and succeed. Yes. And that seems to be so hardwired so often, that actually overcoming our desire to be absolutely right and have everyone agree with us. Yeah. And in a way, that's what seems to always get in the way of these complex negotiations, is everybody wanting their precise position to prevail rather than
stand on that as an ideological position.
Rather than loosening up a little bit and recognizing that there are valid alternative positions. Yeah. And that was some magic in Paris, and there's a sort of wave of that magic, and then it kind of there's an ebb tide as that all goes away. And what I think we're really hoping to do, and starting to see some evidence of, is that sense of slightly messy solidarity coming back for Glasgow.
It's interesting. I mean, we don't need to go into this, but as you know well, I spent formative years of my life as a monk in a Buddhist monastery, and what the line there always used to be, I'd never quite drawn this connection before, but do you want to be right or do you want to be free? Right, because actually that freedom from a necessity to hold and control a particular outcome frees you to allow more momentum and a more positive outcome than you could have controlled if you'd done it. So now, I mean, Paris was Paris, and we thought it was this moment of global solidarity that would usher in a new era of multilateralism, and it was amazing. And then the world went in a completely different direction. But now we're back, right? And so now, is Glasgow the same game in terms of how you change the world? Do we need to build that sense of collective momentum towards a shared outcome, or is it different?
Well, I think it's the same in the sense of needing to build a collective sense of momentum towards a shared outcome. The difference is that in Paris we were trying to agree that shared outcome, right? And now we've agreed that, and actually the rules of the game have moved slightly because of the science and because of the clarity that getting to net zero emissions by 2050 will have huge economic benefits and human benefits compared to taking much longer. Yeah. And we've seen that with this sort of surge of countries and businesses and investors committing to that earlier goal, the sort of top end of Paris Agreement. Yeah. The question now is whether we can build enough sense of momentum in the real world, in the real economy. Like, are things actually changing? Have people just changed what they said they were aiming for, or are they actually changing their behaviour in terms of policy, in terms of investment, in terms of technology, in terms of decisions that we all make? So I think that's going to be the test of Glasgow, because I think now we have got, we really are landing on this net zero by 2050 as being the shared goal. Yeah. But do people believe that we're doing enough to get there? We're not doing enough now. Will Glasgow be a moment of momentum building.
And that's so interesting because, I mean, what you see now, of course, is one of the big things that's changed since Paris is there's real anger now, right? Because the impacts have become so much worse. We've realized that we're facing a disastrous future if we don't deal with that. And in a very helpful way, what we've seen is this emergence of civil disobedience with a kind of verve and tenacity that we haven't seen for a generation. But what that also means is that that is coming with an understandable amount of skepticism towards what's being said as a commitment. So how do we bring those pieces together? Because, you know, as we're going back to where we were before, one of the keys to Paris was throwing our arms wide, saying everyone's welcome, it's all about momentum. It feels that this is about that, but we also need to drill down and say, are we sure it's really happening? Is it really changing fast enough? Because now this is our last moment.
Frustration is all totally understandable, right? If you're a teenager and you read the science for the first time and you discover how long we've known about the issue and how little's been done and that we're still not going the right direction, it's shocking. So anger is kind of an appropriate response. The question is how to channel those sort of emotions into steps that make a difference. So I mean, just recently the court case in Germany where, you know, children have taken the government to court, saying that the government's climate plans were not legal because they weren't ambitious enough in terms of protecting their rights, and they've won that. Yeah. So that's amazing. At the same time, we see, you know, investors who have not been moving fast suddenly committing to net zero, but being met with huge skepticism because people understandably judge them on what they've done in the last 5 years.
Yeah.
I think this is the interesting dance now: is will the skeptics' desire to be right trump their willingness to recognize that everybody has to change and it's possible that people change, but they have to be held accountable.
Yes.
So rather than rejecting everybody who says, okay, I understand it now, I realize I haven't done enough, now I'm committed and here's my plan.
Yeah.
You know, if that's not listened to,
yes.
then we risk a kind of polarization and not a solidarity moment, but a shouting match.
Yes.
When people aren't actually listening to the valid fears and concerns and pushes for much earlier action, and the valid acknowledgements of responsibility and moves towards much faster action, and those two coming together. I mean, there may still be a gap, but if we're converging, I mean, you know, I think we've got sort of Extinction Rebellion saying 2025, and we've got other people saying 2080. That's a huge gap, but you know, I talk about electric vehicles as a prime example of that. 5 years ago, the IEA said we'll be buying combustion engine cars in 2080.
Yeah.
Now, pretty much everyone's agreeing it's going to be between 2030, 2035. So the future can come forward by about 50 years, and we can converge on that. And there will still be people saying we should ban all combustion engines from the roads tomorrow, but that would be politically.
But that's useful as well, right? I mean, that sets a flag, and as long as there's a strength of conviction with that type of statement that comes with an underlying pragmatism that sort of fits with the reality of the world, you're making a statement that moves the Overton window of possibility closer, but then at the end of the day, you understand what's really going to happen.
Yeah, and I do think the key thing here is that we become students of how change actually happens in complex industrial systems, right? It never happens overnight from the moment we realize there's a problem or something needs to change. But it does happen incredibly fast once we get to that kind of inflection point, you know, because we know that change goes exponential.
And that's really interesting because, you know, you can live through this moment and understand it in so many different ways, right? And because it's become so important, the emotions have gotten high. It's going to be a real test for us in terms of whether we can stick together, do the work that we can do without getting divided, which is going to be a real challenge, because you can look at this work and say, it's lumpy, right? We make progress in Paris, it gets knocked back by Trump, we're back in again, is it enough? And you get very frustrated by watching that ping. But I've heard you talk a lot about a very different perspective, which is around exponential change.
Yeah, I mean, of course, Trump, in the sense of multilateralism and the sense of federal policy on climate change, was a huge step backwards. But remember, he got elected on a bring back coal campaign, and coal-fired power plants, right on time, were shut down faster under his administration than previous ones, because the technology's moved on, and you know, no one's going to invest in a coal-fired power plant in America now, and pretty soon no one will invest in a coal-fired power plant anywhere in the world, because so much work's been done to bring the cost down, and the pressure from science, from society, from policymakers, and now from investors is like, no, we're not going to fund you.
Yeah.
I mean, just this huge upswell of banks and asset managers committing to net zero, which they're now going to have to put into practice, and they will be held accountable by skeptical civil society. Just this week saw Moody's, the credit rating agency, saying credit is going to be squeezed for heavy emitting companies who haven't got good plans. In other words, the cost of borrowing is going to go up for companies who are not on track. And then just this week, IAG, the big airlines group, I mean, airlines really one of the sort of iconic industries that, like, why are we flying? Why are we burning kerosene? You know, do you want to stop developing countries from having all the benefits of flying? It's really contentious. Yeah. We know that one of the keys is to shift to electrifying short haul. That's happening quite fast.
Or banning short haul in the case
or banning short haul in the case of France. Electrifying it in the case of Norway, said by 2040. But at the moment, 0.01% of fuel is sustainable aviation fuel. So it's kind of trivial. So, but if you take that as your starting point and say we've got to get to 50% by 2030, it's sort of failing the pragmatism test, and it doesn't follow that logic of the exponential curve. But whereas what we've seen emerging is this consensus that if we get to 2%, 200 times current by 2025, and 10%, 1,000 times current by 2030, then you're on that really steep trajectory. I think we end up getting to 100% in the late 30s then, because you've got so much momentum piling in to the technology, as well as changes in legislation around shifting from short haul to electrified trains, as well as
I think that's something we have to all educate ourselves in and understand the change, right? Because to live through an exponential time is very difficult intellectually to understand. I mean, in a way, we've just had the most amazing lesson as the amateur epidemiologists we've all become in the COVID pandemic, right? I mean, in that, it matters very little what the number of infected people is at any 1 minute. It's the doubling rate and the infection rate that can actually take you. I saw someone say that even if there was only 1,000 people infected, if the doubling rate was every 2 days, you'd have the whole world infected within less than 4 months, you know? So actually that kind of change, even if you start from a small base, it feels, I mean, I remember that in solar, you know, my dad works in oil and gas. He was always very derisive about solar. It's 1%, it's 2%. It took from the 1970s to, you know, till the Paris Agreement in 2015 to go from 0 to about 2%. And if you draw that forward in a straight line, it's not going to make any meaningful difference to any kind of energy generation at all. But then if it doubles every 2 years from then we've pretty much done it in the next 10 years.
And of course, that was the first big climate technology change, right? Yeah. So, I mean, I think in Paris, I just read less than 1% of the world could you produce solar energy competitively with fossil fuel power generation. Okay. Now we're at like 3/4 of the world, and it'll soon be 100%. Yeah. So, but those development times are being compressed because there's so much more urgency around the need to get to zero. So whereas it might have taken 3 decades for solar, 2 decades for electric vehicles, it'll take 1 decade for green hydrogen, you know, and some of the other technologies like ammonia for shipping. It's just again, so one thing in terms of, you know, creating the future that I pay a lot of attention to is what stories are we telling ourselves about the future, and are they really anchored in an understanding of how things change, or are they anchored in the fear of change? Yes. So whenever I hear somebody saying this will never change, or they will never do that, or governments will never do that, or people will never change their habits, I'm like, oh, that's interesting. I remember when I was newly married 20 years ago, Anne, my wife, saying, if you ever get a mobile phone, I'll divorce you. Well, we're happily married. How's that going? We're happily married.
Do you have a phone?
We've both got mobile phones. We sometimes text each other from my office in the basement to her office in the, and I travel a lot, or used to travel a lot. Can't live without video phones. So we can change very, very quickly. And I think you're right. The understanding of just how much you can get it wrong when you arrogantly say, "Oh, we're only at 1%," rather than saying, "Shit, we doubled in the last 6 months." And you see how quickly governments have got behind the curve of the virus. Same thing happens in technology. If you're a company, you're like, "Oh, it's never going to change," and you're not investing in the early stages, suddenly all your competitors are disappearing over the horizon whilst you're struggling to figure out how to catch up.
Well, that's a great point, because I mean, Glasgow is an important stepping stone in this decade, but people should understand that this is it, this decade, right? I mean, we've left dealing with climate change so late that unless we can get to a 50% reduction by the end of the decade, fortunately now the US has committed to doing that, but that's a lot more needs to happen beyond that, we're going to have lost control of the climatic system. And there feels to me now that there's enough momentum from key decision makers around the world to give us a pretty good shot at that, right? I mean, no success is guaranteed, but real success is possible in this transformation. And what a remarkable thing that would be to do that in this decade, right? And then we're on the downhill run towards net zero before 2050. But I just wonder, for people who are watching this, probably involved in managing money, involved in decision making at different levels, how do you go on that journey in a way where you're not trying to necessarily be the greenest ESG fund, but you don't want to get left behind and you want to be part of that transformation? What kind of thinking helps in that, do you think?
I mean, it does help to do a little bit of reading.
Yeah.
Just read one of the summaries of the science, and the economics, the fact that, yes, there's a cost to a transition, but the counterfactual has to be, the alternative future of not acting has a much bigger cost. So it's no longer a societal choice of whether we get to zero, because the science is so overwhelming, and you can see the next generation, whether it's your kids or the next wave of super smart graduates that you want to hire, will expect you to be on top of this. And also, disruptive change is about opportunity, right? I mean, every single major market in the world is going to be using different technology, so the huge addressable markets are opening up to new technology and new business models. So I think, and pay attention to those small signals. Like small signals now from major incumbents, not from wacky startups only. From Moody's, from IAG, from Uniper, German power company who were going to build an LNG terminal, liquid natural gas, and now decided for shipping that fuel has no future. They're going to build a green hydrogen and green ammonia terminal instead. So you see, when major players are starting to do that, and the incumbents we know are often quite slow.
Yeah.
So pay attention to those signals, and think really seriously about whether the company you're running or the people who are managing your money are also paying attention to those signals and adjusting accordingly. Because otherwise, there's a risk of what we call stranded assets. That your money or your company end up stuck playing a game that no one else is playing anymore, and that it's very costly to get out of.
It's that sort of old saying that how do you go bankrupt? First very slowly and then very fast, right? I mean, that's how things tend to happen, right? It takes ages to get to the point of crisis, and then all of a sudden you turn around and everything's transformed. And I completely agree with everything you said. The other thing that I would really like to see is, I don't know if you agree with this analysis, but the climate movement is a bit confused in some ways. There's multiple different perspectives, and we talked about this earlier of everybody knows a lot about what's going on, and there's different perspectives, and that can send a message that isn't always sort of clear as a bell to the rest of the world in terms of the direction that people are going in and what we want to kind of get out of this. But I do feel that there is, in that context, with that exponential transformation happening in the world, there's a role now for everyone else to come along and say, you know what, we've looked at this, and we can do it. We can be the generation that turns this around inside this decade. We can generate more value. We can create the future that we want to create. We can create good new jobs, clean air, all these other different things. And I kind of feel like the world doesn't need to take its lead necessarily from people who do this day to day as NGOs thinking about climate. Everyone can be a leader in this now, can decide what's needed, and can lead in their own field.
Well, I mean, first of all, humanity is messy, right? So people have lots of different ideas, and that's just normal, right? I mean, when we never have consensus on anything of any import, so that's fine. But I think you're right that as a movement full of brilliant, passionate people who've been working on something for 10, 20, 30, 40 years, starts to see its vision be taken up by others, there's a sort of slight existential moment of I was the only person who knew all about climate change, and now all these other people who've only just read the book or read the IPCC reports are talking about it and getting lots of credit for doing stuff, and so maybe there's a little bit of that. I think that's kind of that's just normal.
I'm going to ask you the question we always ask in my podcast. So I run a podcast with Christiana Figueres called Outrage and Optimism. You've been on it many times. I think just to end this out, looking now through to Glasgow, through to the end of the decade, do you feel outraged about where we are, or do you feel optimistic?
The podcast title is appropriate because I feel both.
Yeah.
I mean, when I actually think about the lack of activity over the last 30 years, I am really outraged. I mean, the kind of, you know, and I'm full of hope, right? Because I see, because I'm a student of how things do change, and I see, you know, growing evidence that things are changing and can go really fast. I think, you know, there's a much bigger question beyond climate change in terms of creating the future, is about how do we create a thriving and just future for the whole of humanity. I mean, we've talked a lot about technology and how to get emissions to zero, but of course at the heart of the politics of climate change is the
societal shift,
and the injustice that those societies and those generations who've done the least to contribute to the problem are going to bear the burden. So there's a sort of outrage at the injustice which is at the heart, and that goes way beyond climate change. Of course, that's like, how do we ensure that we don't have 1.6 billion people living in slums, you know, who are very susceptible to, and many of those slums are built in floodplains, so they have the most fragile lives when it comes to extreme weather events, or 2 billion people who rely on smallholder farmer incomes, again, very susceptible as smallholder farmers to the changes brought about by climate change. So I think that there's a sort of outrage and optimism around the technological shifts and the societal changes to get to zero. And then I think there's another wave of outrage, and I think less cause for optimism, frankly, and a lot more work to be done on the broader climate and development nexus to make sure that those 1.6 billion slum dwellers and 2 billion smallholder farmers actually have a chance to develop to a healthier, more thriving life and livelihood, and not just a net zero version of poverty.
Totally. We create the world that actually is worth living and that we want to live in. I mean, I agree with you completely. I think climate change, the source of outrage that we should all feel is climate change is fundamentally unfair. Right? It's unfair economically, generationally, geographically, and that's only going to get more painful if we don't get on top of it now, as we see how those things manifest. And we've seen that a bit in COVID, right, in what's happening with India. I mean, we don't want these things to be magnified writ large across a range of different issues. But I also agree, and I know that we've talked about this before, but for me, optimism is now a strategy for success, right? No one's coming along to save us from this. Either we're going to do this and make this transformation, or we're going to be the generation that let this slip. And so in that context, most people, when you say that, they'll feel a little frisson of fear of like, are we going to make it? What's my life going to be like? But I actually think what's required right now in that context is courage. And it's a determination to say, real failure is possible, but real success is possible too. And that makes this the most exciting time to be alive.
Yes, it's possible that the future is terrible. So a certain amount of fear is understandable, but being trapped in that fear is not a way to act. And I've always thought that a stance of hope or optimism requires moral courage, because you're actually saying, I choose to take a stance for a different and a better future, and I will act with the intention of helping to create that, knowing that I may fail, but that
has meaning in and of itself.
And what else can you do? Right, you can give up, right, and then the risk then is that you become right, that the future is terrible. What kind of a weird way is that to live, to actually want so much to be right that you bring on the apocalypse? It's not a life I want to live.
And you only do it subconsciously.
Yeah.
Mate, it's been fun.
It's been great. Better wrap it there.
Good stuff. All right.
Thank you.
Thanks.